Welcome to the American Intelligence Media, the home of the anonymous patriots, truth news headlines, and associations with good friends like Americans for Innovation and Leader Technologies. Today I'm talking with the person who founded Leader Technologies, Michael McKibben. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Good afternoon.
It is such a wondrous time we're in. As we're looking around, some things make me laugh so hard I can hardly stop laughing. And other things are so sad. And some of the saddest things are that the old guard, they're being revealed for what they really are. They are naked. The emperor's new clothes aren't there. And we're seeing one level after the next, one veil after the next removed, until we are looking directly into the eyes of the very people who have created this psyops apocalyptic times that we live in. Stealing technology, but just carrying on imperialistic ideas as if they were the new Arthur and the new round table that's going to solve all of our problems. And I'm talking about Cecil Rhodes. I'm talking about a guy who was so audacious that he named entire countries after himself, that he basically stole entire countries, that he was more powerful at certain moments than the entire British nation, and that he basically constructed an imperialism that took advantage of the Northern Hemisphere countries taking advantage of the Southern Hemisphere countries. So Britain stealing their part of Africa as if it is their right to steal the gold and the diamonds of Africa, and to literally name Rhodesia after the man who stole these lands from the native people, as well as from the Boers and the Afrikaners and the Germans and everybody else, and set us on a road of imperialism that America doesn't even know it has been pulled into and really never let go of by the British Empire. And the revelations that you keep coming up with, Michael, and the research that's going on, especially with some of these people who study lineages and dynasties and people's personal history, it is amazing what we're finding out and how it comes back to just a small group of people. And what we're going to focus on today is Cecil Rhodes' kind of informal round table that he created, which then Viscount, you have probably so many names for Alfred Milner that I don't know all of them, but he was a lord and a baron and a viscount, and I think he was prime minister at one point. He was a general. He was everything. He was one of those powerful people in British history, and people don't even want to talk about him, but he basically created Bolshevism. I mean, he created the rise and the fall of entire nations, this individual acting upon the type of imperialism that was established by Cecil Rhodes with his round table. And we've said this again and again, and people will say, oh, conspiracy. No, it's not a conspiracy. Early on, Cecil Rhodes created the Rhodes Round Table. He worked with Fabians. Then he helped create, or it was the impulse that created, the Pilgrim Society, which was, again, a dinner group of very high, powerful elites on both sides of the Atlantic, Britain and America, trying to create an Anglo-American alliance. And then that became, later, well, Chatham House was used, but later it became the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which was literally called the Round Table. And then that became, in America, formalized as the Council on Foreign Relations. And before that, it was called the Inquiry, which Woodrow Wilson established. And this group tried to establish the League of Nations as a global hegemony, global control, absolute control of the world based upon Anglophiles, in other words, Anglo-Saxons, Brits and Americans, and sometimes they included the Dutch. And they said that these are the people who are supposed to control the world through the League of Nations. And we see through these organizations that they use technology the second that it was created, and many times they actually manipulated it as it was being created, and these insiders bought into the technology, controlled the technology for their own corporate interests, even during the war, so that they had an economic advantage. And this still goes on to this very day. It even moved right out of the Tavistock Institute directly into Facebook recently. And this has been pointed out in some of our recent audios and some of the recent research that Americans for Innovation and some of Michael and his researchers have come up with. And of course, we participate in that, working with our team and our conclave. But the point is we keep revealing more and more of these levels. And now Michael has been working on the will of Cecil Rhodes, how that was to be handed down as basically a new type of corporate monarchy, a dynasty handed down from one male to the next eldest male, if possible, and that a scholarship would be set up so that these males would be brought in from the Commonwealth nations to Britain so they could be brainwashed and turned into people who would be assets that would be sent back into these nations, particularly targeting America. And this is in direct conjunction with the Fabian Society, the Pilgrim Society, Milner's Round Table, which was founded in 1909, which was built upon the informal Round Table of Cecil Rhodes. And what we're saying is very simply this: Cecil Rhodes was insane, and he became more powerful than the British nation. And his round table, he literally thought he was Arthur reincarnated, who had come to rule the world. He thought that his ideas were more powerful and more, well, that actually they were divinely inspired and that they were better than anybody else's ideas, and that if you followed them, that then the whole world would come underneath the control of one global unit, and that unit would be that round table. And later that became Milner's Round Table, and later they called it Milner's Kindergarten, where he trained people in becoming imperialists who could literally war against nations and win and take those nations for the sake of individuals and corporations. And now Michael has also connected this, which is my favorite topic, to the British East India Company. And when he did that, of course, myself and the whole conclave were clapping and jumping up and down, because we believe that we've never left the British East India Company's control of America, and that the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company are still warring over America. And
well, Douglas, we just proved that that is true. We have the lineage all the way back now.
Tell us about it.
Well, as you know, we began this search from wondering who this Baron Richard Allen was that appeared when Zuckerberg did the no-show in London a month or so ago. And we've been working backwards. And, you know, over the time we've heard you talk about many of these things. And for me, I like to hook everything to some form of timeline, because that helps get a context for what is being discussed. And as you know, we started walking back Baron Ricky's, I shouldn't say that, Baron Richard. Some of the folks in England don't like it when we do the Ricky, but I know Americans don't care. We started walking his lineage back and found that his grandfather was the chief of staff for the war cabinet in World War II, and he was in charge of the Tavistock brainwashing and propaganda program in World War II, and then helped that organization divest into the stay-behind networks after World War II, which then became the CIA, the OSS. Actually, it was first the SOE, the Strategic Operations Executive. Then it became the OSS, and then the rogue CIA. So they reorganized all those agents. They had stay-behind agents in all those countries, and just repurposed them from fighting the Germans to fighting the Soviets. So, and then as we kept marching backwards in time to see who these people were associated with, it only took one generation to stop at the formation of the political interests that became World War I, and then we saw this formation under Prime Minister Lloyd George of the British War Cabinet that completely reorganized the way the 10 Downing Street was operating, and it consolidated power into 5 people, and then had hundreds of advisors, and then they proceeded to print up their minutes and distribute their minutes in an obvious strategy to create leaks. And then we started looking at the personalities of that war cabinet, and one person stood out greater than all the rest, and that was Lord Alfred Milner. And we started looking at various aspects of his background at that time, and we saw that he was instrumental, if not the leader, with Tsar Nicholas Romanov when he abdicated. He had just met with Milner a few weeks earlier, and then he abdicated, and people are looking into that right now, and what we can see now is that Milner made a secret trip to Moscow from Petrograd or St. Petersburg, in which he met with members of the Duma that were going to assume control when the Tsar abdicated. So it was very clear that Milner had his fingers right in the middle of that whole mess that became the Bolshevik Revolution. And then at the same time, contemporaneous with Milner being in Moscow, Lenin is starting to make his way to St. Petersburg in his sealed train with his gold, supported by Western banks. So the story that we've all learned in the history books about World War I appears to be a story now that should be told regarding British hegemony and the British intent to dismember the German competitive economic competition as well as the Russian economic competition, so that the British and Americans could rule the planet in commerce. That appears to me now to be the real reason for World War I, and that everything we have all learned in our lifetimes appears to have been total fabrication, written by novelists to feed the public false stories, to keep them silent, to keep them from asking questions, and while the warmongers and the warlords made their money, loaning money and making armaments for both sides during the war. And then with Milner, that was the last. Americans for Innovation did an article around that subject and stopping it at World War I and looked at that as a nexus. But then our researchers started asking the question, let's start digging more into Milner, and that quickly led us to South Africa, where it turns out that both Lord Milner and Cecil Rhodes were prime ministers and chief commissioners of the Cape Colony down in South Africa. And as you've mentioned many times, that's when the Round Table got started, and it appears to have been both of these men that were involved with that, and then that evolved into Milner's Kindergarten, which was an organization that he used to recruit young, mostly Oxford graduates, to help him in his administration in South Africa, and then these people were quickly propelled into the top positions throughout the British Empire. But the interesting thing is there was a key philosophy that was being developed out of Oxford, which seems to be driving everything that we see to this day, and that is a concept called British Federalism. And it appears that the common thinking at that time was that as the British Empire was divesting control of all of its colonies, they never really intended to give up control of the resources of those colonies. But what they learned is they needed to give up control for a while that colony got used to being, quote, independent. But then their intent was to pull them back into the sphere of the British federal approach to organizing the world, because these people really believed that the British way of governance that was very much based on the Lord of the Manor approach, where the Lord of the Manor owns the property in a whole area and then manages the commerce and social life of the people within that person's realm, is the proper method for organizing humanity across the board. And so, as you say, it was very Anglo-Saxon in orientation. And Cecil Rhodes and Lord Milner appear to be two of the top organizers of this methodology that I think is governing what we see today. I think these people have co-opted the senior executive service. I think the senior executive service is doing their bidding, and that the real power in this world remains with these British Federalists out of London and the Privy Council, and that they are in fact continuing to dictate American policy, with America being their big prize among their Federalist participants. And so as we looked at Milner, the researchers in England started looking at his background and his relationships, and it didn't take very long, Douglas, to see that he was related to his great uncle was a member of Parliament for the City of London, along with Lionel Nathan Rothschild, and they, along with two others, were the members of Parliament for the City of London, which is the financial district, and and his great uncle was called John Masterman, and he was part of an attorney firm with his son, also named John Masterman, in the City of London. And then the Masterman, one of the Masterman daughters, married a Rhodes, and that was his father, was Cecil Rhodes' father. So here we have, and the other key point I need to make is that the great uncle Masterman, John Masterman, was a director of the British East India Company. So there you have it. There's your connection, unbroken connection, right up to what we have now identified as the current members of the Privy Council and the way that they are interfering in American government and American sovereignty. And it appears they have been ever since the days of the British East India Company, which predate 1776, the American Revolution, and which, in fact, just as an FYI, the flag of the British East India Company has 7 red stripes and 6 white stripes, just like the American flag does. And some historians think that's where we got our design for the flag. So the only difference is up in the what is the blue and white stars on our flag is replaced with the Union Jack on the British East India Company. So it looks like a lot of people at the time of the Revolution were quite aware of this British federalism that would end up driving their political policy worldwide to this day. And it appears to be an endemic plan to interfere in the sovereign actions of countries throughout the world, including the United States.
And another beautiful point of your research, which got me all excited, is that the British East India Company stole a lot of land. And some of that land literally became some of the early land that Cecil Rhodes got in South Africa. I mean, literally, he got the British East India Company's land.
It's in his will.
That's just disturbing. But what is very clearly shown here, that from the beginning, the German Hanseatic League, and much later, in 1600, the Dutch East India Company, and then in 1602 and 1604, the formalization of the British East India Company, they started going to India and to Africa and basically stealing all the resources they could. They stole the spices, they stole the resources, they set up their theft of their gold, of diamonds, through diamond mines. And basically, these were imperialists who believed that they could go and simply, they used to say the British East India Company and Dutch East India Company were merchants with a sword. In other words, if you didn't do business with them, they killed you. They stole your land. They stole your resources. And because they were white supremacists, right? I mean, they believed that the white race was superior to these races and that they should subjugate them and take their resources and basically manage it in a higher, more developed, more cultured level. And this is the nonsense.
As the Lord of the Manor.
As the Lord of the Manor. And that they somehow deserve this elitism, but it goes along with monarchism. Monarchs believe that they have the divine right of kings or queens, in the case of Britain right now. They even, of course, people forget this, but the Church of England is led by the Queen of England. And they forget that, just like many other religions, hegemony is the highest issue for them. World control, global control. And who in the Church of England, unfortunately, it's Anglo-Saxons and or the Anglo-American axis, or you can include the
Douglas,
Dutch in
can
there.
Can I read you from Rhodes's will?
Please.
A case in point. He says, I humbly believe that one of the secrets of England's strength has been the existence of a class termed, quote, the country landlords, who devote their efforts to the maintenance of those on their own property. So in other words, we get to own everything, we get to tell you what to do, and as benevolent lords, we will take care of you. And before we get too far away from your point about the resource stripping that the British East India Company did, I need to point out that from 1897 to 1905, Milner was the High Commissioner and Governor of Cape Colony, and he followed Rhodes, who had been the Cape Colony Prime Minister from 1890 to 1896. And then the interesting thing is, the very next year, in 1897, Rhodes became the first chairman of the De Beers diamond mines in South Africa, financed by N.M. Rothschilds. And then he spent years consolidating control of a large portion of the diamond mining in Kimberley, which is where they discovered not only diamonds but also gold. And I don't know, if I were a Rhodes Scholar, I would be a little bit bothered by some of this information, because those mines are infamous for their abuse of their workers historically. And that supply continues to finance at least some of these Rhodes Scholarships today. So what we see is a group of white supremacists who are racist, who are sexist, because only men could inherit these holdings, and they were stripping the resources of other countries in order to benefit those who received these scholarships. And then by the middle of this last century, after Rhodes's death, he set up a way of inheritance called tail mail. And tail mail is a way to for somebody to specify in their will that the estate that they're leaving could not be sold off and would have to be passed down to the senior male heir. And then, curiously, his two male heirs in 1938, 39, were two sons of one of his brothers, Ernst. And one of those brothers died at the very young age of, let me get these dates. They were very young. Okay. His nephew, Cecil, at age 32, died of a heart attack at a Swiss hotel on December 12th of 1936, which was just 2 days after Edward VIII abdicated the British throne. And then 18 months later, his brother, William, died at age 40 in a nursing home in Ayr, Scotland. So with those two deaths, the management of the Rhodes Trust passed to the control of Parliament and the Privy Council, where it is to this day. So it's really clear. The Rhodes Scholarships were a primary recruiting ground for those that these people were grooming for this British federalism agenda.
Well, you are just nailing so many issues here that I'd love to just jump on and go wild with, because federalism then leads into this concept of the empire or imperialism. Federalism, the concentration of the government into a small central group, where in this case, again and again, you have demonstrated, whether it's Cecil Rhodes' Roundtable, or whether it's the War Cabinet, or whether it's the Tavistock Institute, these are a few people in those positions who had astounding power. Now, is it Viscount Milner? What was his highest title? You're the title king here, so.
Well, that was one of his titles.
So
he was generally a lord. I've seen it referred to as Viscount. I haven't really studied that much more than that.
Well, after he was part of the Boer War, the first and the second one, he basically started and won the second one. He cleaned up in the Transvaal with the Afrikaners, with the Boers, fighting the Dutch, fighting the Germans. Also, there was a group of Germans that he was fighting, because this was imperialistic fighting for these resources, and he was so good at it that literally they put the British kingdom into his hands, and there was hardly a decision that was made, including the abdication, including any war decisions. There wasn't a single war decision made without Viscount Milner being part of it. Even when he came back after he showed such astounding political acumen, in the style of Cecil Rhodes, basically the most horrifying imperialistic federalism that anybody's ever seen, even probably making the British East India Company members of the First Corporation blush. Viscount Milner comes back, and what does the Queen do? Puts her Rio Tinto mining resources into his hands. I mean, this guy was not only then created in 1909 the Milner Roundtable, which made very official what the, as you pointed out, white supremacist, racist, imperialistic, federalism, globalism. I mean, these are the first globalists who literally said, now let's make the plan on how we're going to make this work. Let's create the system that makes it work. But I also want to give a shout out to Christopher Strunk, who last time left some good remarks to make sure that I always keep remembering to point out that it was the Germans who were so good at this to begin with. So Kaiser Wilhelm's Institute in 1911, or even before informally, they were doing the craziest stuff that then the British said, well, if they're going to do that type of warfare, psychological warfare, behavioral manipulation, brain measuring. I mean, they opened up the brains of prisoners to just measure the size of them to see if being criminal could be found in the size of the brain. The Germans did not hesitate to state that they were the leaders of the world and that they were the Aryans, the true Aryans. They started to develop what's called Ariosophism. In other words, the wisdom of believing that the Aryan race should rule all other races. And this is the basis of the Second Reich. And this, you have to stand back and say, oh, the German imperialists believed that they were now the new Roman Empire, the new Roman imperial empire? Yes, they did. And then they started to build up the propaganda to convince others of that. And then they started to say, now, we don't only just need to rule Germany, we need to rule anything that Germany in the past ever owned. Oh, now we need to...
Let me interrupt you, because one of the things that came out of the will is that originally Cecil Rhodes' scholarships included German students. And it was an act of Parliament that nullified that after his death, which is an interesting fact. So he wasn't anti-German. This occurred later, and I think this occurred under Milner, as Germany became less controllable. these facts don't lie. And one of the things that it just blows my mind is I'm asking myself, I thought I was a pretty good student, but I never heard any of this stuff in school and history. And what I realize now is that these people not only took control of the banking and the political realm, they took control of technology and psychiatry. And with this group of powers, they created the narratives that we all grew up with, which of course would not talk about this, because this is the real truth behind what's going on in our world, and what we get is the sanitized version. And that is something that I think is now coming out. We're starting to figure out all the lies that we've been told our whole lives. I mean, I'm looking at the one of the New York papers the day that the Russian Tsar abdicated, and I'm seeing this big, chunky-looking man, manly man, breaking off the chains. And what they're talking about there is that the Russian people are breaking off the chains at the with Lenin being the one that's helping them break the chains. And that is occurring, that article and that picture came out the very day that he abdicated. And if you think about that in real news terms, there's no way they could have been ready for that unless it was all fake.
Well, let's remember the abdication of Edward in England, the abdication of a monarch in Russia. What happens if you can get rid of the monarchs? Then it falls back to the corporations. And so Milner is just one guy who had so much power that he makes Winston Churchill look like a schoolboy. He had so much power that literally the British kingdom was given into his hands. He was a member of the British Privy Council that has its own private central bank. It has its own to support the monarchy. So notice that he wasn't giving up the monarchy in England that he was manipulating through the Privy Council, but he certainly wanted the Russians to give up their monarchy. And this man single-handedly did that. Why did Milner not like the Germans? Because Milner in South Africa went after the few thousand Germans that were in the western portion of South Africa because they were sitting on some land that he wanted. And so he hated the fact that anyone was giving Cecil Rhodes white supremacy for Anglophiles more attention than Kaiser Wilhelm was giving to the Aryan white supremacy that demanded to not only take over Germany, but most of Europe, and then all the way back into Russia. And so Milner feared Russia and Germany uniting, especially underneath a Second Reich. And what happened in the end, what didn't happen in World War I, happened again in World War II. Look at the propaganda for the Third Reich. Look at the propaganda for Aryans justifying killing Jews. I mean, you can see that the
and we've got the development of apartheid.
Yes, apartheid. You can see the brainwashing is so effective that there is nothing, literally nothing, that you can come up with that could be more outrageous than what they convinced people of, which were outright lies. And that shows the power that started early on through the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and behavioral manipulation, war psyops.
Well, let's talk about communication, because I think we have to keep that in mind. These are all individual facts, but I think what they saw in Nikola Tesla's invention of the wireless, which they then attributed to Marconi as the cutout, was they saw the first opportunity they'd ever had to unify their British federalism message globally if they could seize control and control wireless, which is what they did. They immediately introduced a bill, an act of Parliament to basically nationalize Marconi's wireless throughout the empire on all steamships. And those steamships essentially were the British embassies around the planet. And so that was their first attempt. And then they applied the propaganda and the psychiatry to their messages in the wireless. And so they learned that they could, in fact, unify their strategy worldwide with that technology, which was 100 years ago. And now we roll forward to what we talked about before, when Chandler saw that we had solved the problem of scalability using the internet to communicate globally to millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people at the same time, they saw the next step in the ability to unify their message on a global basis. Now they're applying much more sophisticated psychiatric techniques and mind-bending techniques, which they call opinion making. So they're literally reprogramming people to make them think certain ways. And so what we now see happening in our world is the next phase that started 100 years ago in one sense with technology and has continued on. It really hasn't changed. The people have changed, the capabilities to do it faster have changed, but nothing they're doing has changed.
Absolutely. And that is the key factor, is information. When information started to flow so fast, that's where the war went. Information technology is what controls our world to this very day. Most of us don't know how any of the IT works. We give it to our IT people, and they can say whatever they want because IT rules the world at this point. And when we saw in World War I that they cut the cable through the North Atlantic to the Germans, and then they started intercepting those, changing those communications, that was when information warfare started, electronic warfare. And it became so powerful that it can't even be measured to this very day. What we saw with the supposed Russian interference in the elections, that was actually British Strategic Communications Laboratory interfering through the Global Information Center. But we see that they are able to manipulate what people think so effectively that they can hide these gigantic lies right in front of us. Look at the gigantic lies that happened from the World War I Kaiser Wilhelm Institute behavioral modification that by the 40s became the Frankfurt School. After World War II, in the mid-40s, it became later what was paperclip, and those same German scientists.
You need to add in there the Tavistock Institute, which was in parallel to the Frankfurt Institute.
They were joined together, and what we see is the sophistication became so profound that those group of people then left Germany, went through Britain, came to America, and started those same experiments here in America because they pay off. And that basically became...
Well, you were just telling me about that. You're talking to a prime source of that information, somebody who saw this in action, I believe, in New York, right?
That is true. I'm speaking to a witness of these things now.
Yeah.
And it's very fascinating because who knew that, I mean, we knew about paperclip. We knew about especially the scientists who were working on war weapons. But the psychological warfare that was going on, the perception management, the ability to control narratives, brain research, basically torture, and every single kind of stress.
Can I stop you there? Because one of the things this person was in charge of was actually keeping the brains in inventory in New York, right?
That and many other of the most horrifying things I've heard.
Unbelievable.
And so what we have here is German imperialism may have come up with what we think is crazy white supremacy, believing that the Aryans, and by the way, they can't prove any of this Aryan anything because there really is no such purity. Same thing with the Anglo-Saxons or the Anglophiles. That's basically a myth. But what has happened is it's been corporatized. It was turned...
How about we talk about human beings?
Exactly. Instead of...
Would that be a novel idea?
Well, remember, the Dutch East India Company, the #1 slave traders, they don't care about human beings. They never did. And from the beginning, they didn't only just steal the land and the resources, they stole the people and turned them into slaves. And the Dutch East India Company delivered more slaves to the southern part of America than anybody else. And the northern part was served through the British East India Company. delivering their spoiled tea and their spoiled goods to America, making us use their currency, putting taxes on everything, and entering into industry so that what was produced by the slaves in the southern part, this is the global hegemony they have. The white supremacists in the northern keep the slaves in the southern hemisphere or the southern section under their control so that they can do the labor and the work that then supports industrialization. That's the story of the American Revolution. It was the British East India Company fighting the Dutch East India Company. That's what the American Revolution was about, folks. We are yet out of that revolution. We are still underneath the imperialistic desires of the Brits, and Cecil Rhodes was nothing more than a continuation of that, except that instead of just the monarchs saying it and hiding it in their Privy Council and hiding it through laws that protect them, so you can't even look into the business of the monarchs. You can't look into the business of the Privy Council or the central bank, the Bank of England. No one can look at it.
When
Why?
you say Cecil Rhodes, you have to say at the same time the Rothschilds.
Good point.
Because they've been doing deals since the 1700s, and his uncle and his great uncle were all within the financial district in the city of London, UK, and they ran a bank. His great uncle was named Masterman. They ran a bank together with the Rothschilds, and they served as MPs together. And he was also the deputy chief policeman of the city of London. He could actually organize armies. So we're talking about an unbroken chain of control from the Bank of England right through the Revolution, right through the Federal Reserve, right to today. And we see the names. We know the people now.
Yeah, and the Rothschilds directly supporting Cecil Rhodes and Milner, and particularly through Beers, controlling the price of diamonds completely, 100% a monopoly.
And gold.
Oh, gold also. Remember that the Rothschilds set out of their office in the city of London the daily spot price for gold and silver for decades. I don't know how long. So when people say the Rothschilds behind everything, folks, there were many, many Rothschilds. There were the 5 different families, and now everyone who comes from them, many Rothschilds.
Douglas, it's a dynasty. It's a dynasty just like Cecil Rhodes' dynasty was, although it didn't last as long because he wasn't married and had no kids. So it was passed to his nephews until they got knocked off. But this tail male way of inheritance is how they maintain these dynasties. The tail male is a specific kind of legal writing that locks in the future inheritors of a property into multiple generations. So the person who wrote the tail male will can be long dead and still be running their empire from the grave.
Oh, Cecil
and
Rhodes.
That's the way they've maintained. That's the way they've maintained their power.
Like the First Reich, Cecil Rhodes is a man who has become a god. Even after he dies, he's still controlling his imperialistic, horrifying, evil desires that have cost the life of millions. And that is no exaggeration.
And think of the way he's poisoning the minds of these Rhodes scholars from the grave, because he is basically paying their way through Oxford. And by the end of that, they've recruited the people that they are grooming for their higher order of activity, both not only in the UK and in the dominions of the British Commonwealth, but also in America. And to me, this is the real seditious aspect of this. They're intervening in the sovereign governance of our country through these political control mechanisms, political and financing control mechanisms. And these are the things that are controlling our secret SES, the Senior Executive Service, and why Washington and our entire political system is so darn broken. Everyone is bought off. I mean, I know I'm speaking in generalities, but that's probably almost true.
Every time money flows, greed comes as a temptation, and it seems as if in the modern age, because of Cecil Rhodes and Viscount Milner and others like them, these corporate pigs who believe that they should rule the world while others are their slaves, they create what are called archetypal idols. And these idols then become something worshipped, and the Milner Kindergarten would be a group that were taught to worship these type of idols. And these idols are pure evil, saying that one group is more entitled to something than another group is, or that the imperialists can come in and take over your country and take your resources and make you slaves, and that's okay. We'll even make laws that make that all right. And that they do this all sitting around sipping tea, and that everything is okay while they're committing machinations of evil. These are the idols that have come to America, not only through the senior executive service, but through the entire bureaucracy that wants to believe that when you get in one of these positions, you are like a landed gentry, like you were describing before, both out of Cecil Rhodes' will and otherwise, that you think that you are more entitled, that you are landed gentry, you are a lord, you're a baron, you're a viscount, you are some type of higher being, and that others must serve you. This is the type of idols that have created the evil in our own White House, on the Capitol Hill, in Washington D.C., in the entire political stream.
Well, and we've got to add New York. We've got to add New York and the bankers in, because what we're seeing is that this relationship to the Rothschilds derives the relationships of all of our banks with the international money flow. And it appears that the London banks especially direct the activities of the Federal Reserve. So you said many times, we need to get rid of the Federal Reserve. I am with you.
And you named it, and you nailed it. It is these political banking dynasties. The Warburgs married Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds married Rockefellers, and the Rockefellers married Coons, and the Coons married Loebs, and the Loebs married... These are the banker families that I keep describing.
Tail mill.
Absolutely. And what happens is, these are inbred dynasties of warlord bankers that started from the Hanseatic League and the bankers of Hamburg and the bankers of Lubeck, and then the bankers of Holland, of the Dutch bankers, and then literally the corporations, the Dutch East India Company, and the banks that supported them, and then the British East India Company, and the banks, and the City of London. When we say the City of London, we don't mean London. We mean 1 square mile where all of these evil economic machinations go down, with the Rothschilds have their bullion gold, where they supposedly have the gold that's banking the Bank of England, where all of the big deals go down in that square mile. And they answer to the Knights of Malta, who answers to the Vatican, who answers to the Vatican, has its own bank. They're criminal too. So, and they the great uncle, Cecil Rhodes' great uncle, had an office and a house within that square mile. See what you come up with every day, where you just go, wow. He probably had a Templar address. And we're finding out again and again that many of these protected organizations like the Integrity Initiative, where do they have their headquarters? Right there in the City of London, in the Templar building, as a matter of fact. The very headquarters of the Templar is where they're running a new Tavistock Institute type organization, which is really cyber warfare of the highest level. Because why? They just keep changing the name. That's what the Brits do. When they found a corrupting organization, we have found now, they also found 2 or 3 other companies that are dummy companies, prepared for when the first company goes bankrupt, that they just simply move it to their other organizations that are already prepared from the beginning. This is the City of London way. This is the way of the Jesuits. This is the way of the Vatican Bank. This is the way of the Vatican City. And these things are institutions that have been going on for thousands of years. And what we're fighting is a dynasty. And you keep pointing out more of these historical connections. I have a degree in British history, and you have pointed out more of these dynasty connections than I ever came across in all of my studies. And it's astounding that it goes back to a few people, a few families. If you take out the Privy Council, you take out most of the evil that has infested most of the world, folks. That's less than 600 people. So when they say there's a group of 300 people that control the world, that's probably 300 out of the 600 of the Privy Council. Because really, it's a small group of people. So the insider trading is simply a cousin calling a cousin to say what they're about to do in one country, that if one other cousin moves a few million or billion dollars, they make 10 times the amount of money because of insider trading. But it's not insider trading, it's a cousin calling a cousin. Or in many cases, it's simply the husband and wife having pillow talk and people telling you that there's a firewall between them. Don't you worry. That banker and that lawyer for the SEC, they don't talk when they're sleeping in the same bed. They're married, but don't you worry, there's a firewall between them. This type of lie, if you just study it and you go back to the original people, they literally, don't get me started. Rothschild sent 3 of the largest bankers in America to America. They were simply tellers. And when they arrived in America, they opened multi-million-dollar banks. Tellers. And those banks then, at a certain point, J.P. Morgan was able to control the economy of the United States of America and literally made loans to the United States of America to keep, but he also created that some of those crashes himself. I mean, J.P. Morgan was a teller. It is absurd that the Rothschilds have simply controlled so many banks that right now over 3/4 of the central banks of the world are literally owned by the Rothschild families and family members, and asset management groups which are owned by. So when you look into it, you have to be very sneaky.
It's understandable when you've picked all of your competitors, you are going to be able to control the results no matter which way you go. So that's where we've got to see. I'm thinking like an engineer now. We're identifying the cracks in our foundation, and we're saying now that this foundation may not be recoverable. It may need to be rebuilt.
Absolutely. And you've pointed out so many ways. We're going to talk soon about solid and inrupt, and the way that those are fake, but right. the way that in a way it's easier to do than people know. So what we're doing here is a historical analysis back to the very moments, showing the individuals and their intent for counterintelligence. In other words, sabotage, espionage, undoing the very country that these people worked in, on committees that are unregulated by the government itself, run by robber barons, run by corporate giants. And these things, when you look at them at first, they seem like conspiracy theories. When you look closely, you can literally get down to the individuals, the very dates, the very times that Michael and his researchers are sharing with us. So what we're doing is we're showing you that it is intelligence, and it's a war of information, but the intelligence, whoever controls the intelligence controls the military, controls the politics, controls the nations. And what we have found is most intelligence immediately became counterintelligence. It became lies, espionage, sabotage. And what we are doing is anti-counterintelligence. We are anti-propaganda. We are showing you the sources of it so that you can be free from it. And that is our message. And the message of hope is that many of these organizations in America are now collapsing before our very eyes, which we predicted, few others have. And what we are seeing is a collapse of 100-year-long history of very carefully crafted and very filled with intent of evil to simply control the world, control the globe through a centralized, federalized group that also wanted to have imperialism, control the whole world, control all nations through a confederation or a federation that was centralized, whether it be in Germany, in imperialistic Second Reich Germany, or whether it be in the British attempt at their own Second Reich.
You know, Douglas, this is probably the lecture every new elected official gets when they go to Washington. They probably are pulled into a private room. They're told about this tail mail inheritance that really controls the world. And they're told, you're going to have to suck up because you can't do anything about it. And as an individual, you would feel quite overwhelmed. But what I think is happening is we, the people, are now finishing the job of 1776, where they knew these tail mail inheritance control mechanisms. They wrote a constitution to deal with it, but the bankers quickly pulled it back into their sphere, and now we have to finish the job.
That's right. And 1776 was the birth of corporate control of the world. It was the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company saying, we now want these warlord corporations to rule the world. Instead of the independence of the free United States citizen, it was warlord bankers declaring the independence of these corporations. And that's what we need to stand against.
They patted us on the head like a naughty puppy, then sent their bankers back in along with their traders, and they slowly sucked us back in, and now we need to finish the job.
And we've pointed out many ways that can be done. We created a list of 12 things. Trump's working on all 12 of them. One of the top ones, of course, is to close the Fed, basically let them declare bankruptcy, because we're not going to pay the debt, because it's odious debt, it's illegal debt. And, a few other things, close everything with the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Funds. But by the way, the Council on Foreign Relations, which came out of the Cecil Rhodes, informal Cecil Rhodes Roundtable, and then became the Milner Roundtable in 1909, and became the Royal Institute of International Affairs, became the Council on Foreign Relations. Do not forget that our entire foreign relations, since that time, was decided by a bunch of people who were personally invited to a meeting, a secret meeting, where no one can get invited except the people who were part of it inviting you. In other words, only cronies.
Well, don't forget the Fabian Society and the Pilgrim Society.
Same exact thing. You only get invited if you're one of their cronies. And then what happens in this meeting? They determine what to tell the president to do with foreign relations, and the president always did it until Trump. So this is no joke. This has come right to our very day. This still controlled our lives just a few years ago. Hillary took all of her orders from the Council on Foreign Relations. So did Obama, except that they both went rogue and personalized their own greedy cabals and their basic criminal families and their basic Chicago mob-style takeover of D.C. And, they grabbed everything they could, Hillary with the crypto keys and... don't get me started. The point is that...
Along with Mueller,
exactly,
who's trying to take control of the crypto keys now.
So they all got their piece of the pie, learning from the Brits, learning from the Vatican, learning from the Knights of Malta, who learned it from... Well, we'll get into that. We could get into that another time. But the beginning bankers and the Crusades and the whole thing. So what really is happening here is we are showing you the roots of propaganda, and we're showing you how to cut those roots. And the way to do that is to turn off your mainstream media, because you are being subliminally programmed, and learn how to discern the truth. And when you can do that, then you understand that we live in a falsehood politics age, an age of a post-truth, and we must learn skills of discernment so that we can know what is propaganda.
So let me ask you something, Douglas. Do you ever think in our lifetimes we've not lived in a propaganda age? It seems to me we have been lab rats our whole lives, and we may be coming upon a new age which we've never experienced in our lives. We've had this theory of a free press, but we haven't really had a free press. So let's get there. That's where we need to finish the job of 1776.
I think you're absolutely right. We have not had a single day. We were not underneath the control of, like slaves under the propaganda that tell us what to do. So we're going to break out of that. We've given many, many, many hopeful suggestions of ways to do that, and we're going to keep our work happening. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Americans for Innovation. Thank you, Betsy Ross and her team of Truth News Headlines, which if you read every day, you would be unpropagandized, because you would learn that Truth News Headlines is counter-propaganda. Thank you, Betsy, and your team.
Betsy's got a big bottle of red pills.
Yes, she does. Thank you, Michael, for your conversation today.
You're welcome.